In this video, you will be introduced to three key issues in relation to labeling and bordering in migration contexts. First, definitions have legal and practical significance. Second, words matter. And third, borders are socially constructed but have real consequences for migration. So, let's turn first to definitions. Within forced migration, you will find many definitions in international conventions, domestic law, policies, and programming. These definitions may be arbitrary or problematic, but they have important legal and practical significance. Take, for example, the definition of who is a refugee. In the United Nations Convention of 1951, a refugee is defined as, quote, any person who, as a result of events occurring before 1 January 1951, and owing to well-founded fear of being persecuted for reasons of race, religion, nationality, membership of a particular social group, or political opinion, is outside the country of his nationality and is unable or, owing to such fear, is unwilling to avail himself of the protection of that country, or who, not having a nationality and being outside the country of his former habitual residence as a result of such events, is unable or, owing to such fear, is unwilling to return to it. In this definition, we should note two important criteria. First, the person must have crossed an international border. If they have not, they are considered internally displaced persons. Second, the person must fear persecution for one of the reasons listed. Note, for example, that environmental displacement is not listed as a reason for refugee status. Refugee status accords important legal protections. So, the way a refugee is defined in international and national law is important. This is just one example of how definitions matter in forced migration. Now, let's turn to the second point in this video. Words also matter. How we label and frame a topic has implications for how we think about and engage with that issue. For example, some people may be forced to enter a country of asylum without appropriate documentation or using unofficial channels. Under the Safe Third Country Agreement between Canada and the United States, with very few exceptions, refugee claimants must claim asylum in the first country they arrive in. So, if a refugee claimant attempts to cross from the United States into Canada at an official border crossing, they will be sent back to the United States. To reach Canada, they are therefore forced to make an irregular crossing. Doing so is technically breaking administrative law, but is not a criminal offense. Moreover, under international and Canadian law, a refugee cannot be penalized for using irregular routes or documents. This is why most advocates prefer to talk about irregular migration or irregular crossings. This places the focus on the act, migration or crossings, not the person. Moreover, it emphasizes the administrative nature of the issue. In contrast, labeling such refugee claimants as, quote, illegal migrants, unquote, is problematic because it implies criminality. It also prejudices against the people involved, rather than trying to understand the phenomena. So, it is important to think carefully about the words we use and their connotations. It's also important to be precise in our language and choose terms intentionally, with a full knowledge of their legal and practical consequences. We also need to be aware of the technical and legal definitions, as mentioned in the first point. Now, let's turn to the third point. Borders, whether they be geopolitical, social, or legal, both exclude and include. While we may take for granted borders between countries, they're actually historically and socially constructed. Many were created through processes of colonization, violence, dispossession, and displacement. However, even if borders are socially constructed, they still have real meaning for people's everyday lives, livelihoods, and identities. The current international system is based on the political and legal boundaries of sovereign states. This has practical consequences for people living within and across these states. For example, the Mohawk territory of Akwesasne predates the creation of both what we know now as Canada and the United States. But the Indigenous people living on their ancestral homes now have to contend with multiple borders on a daily basis, as the territory is divided between two Canadian provinces, Ontario and Quebec, and one U.S. state, New York. This means that they have to cross an international border to access health services. This example shows both the arbitrariness of borders, but also their practical and legal meanings. So, to summarize, when thinking about forced migration, we need to understand definitions. We need to be careful and intentional about the language and labels we use. And we should be aware of the arbitrariness, but also practical realities of borders.